Hey guys, welcome to Just Sleep Stories. Have you ever wondered what it truly felt like to be invisible inside a civilization that was, by every other measure, one of the most sophisticated the world had ever produced? Picture a city at the height of the Tang dynasty. It is night, and lanterns float above narrow alleys, their amber light pooling softly on lacquered gates and rain-slicked stone. Somewhere beyond the walls of an imperial palace, scholars are composing poetry about the moon. Officials in silk robes are playing games with words and wine. And in a courtyard that smells of sandalwood and river water, a woman is counting coins in the dark, carefully, quietly, the way people count things they are not supposed to have. She is not a princess, she is not a merchant's wife. She is not, by any official document, supposed to matter at all. And yet she does. What kind of world produced her? What silent economy ran beneath the gleaming surface of dynastic China? What did a woman do with money she had earned in a world that told her she should not exist? And how, across 1,000 years of changing emperors and crumbling walls, did certain women manage to accumulate wealth, influence, and something that, in the quietest corners of history, begins to look remarkably like power? These are questions the official records do not like to answer. They preferred to speak of ministers and generals, of rivers and grain and celestial omens. But beneath all of that, stitched into the fabric of every prosperous dynasty, there was another economy, one that moved through tea houses and pleasure quarters, through gifts and debts and whispered arrangements, one that was almost entirely run on the hidden earnings of women. If this story helps you settle into the quiet tonight, perhaps consider subscribing to this channel. It is a small gesture, but it genuinely keeps these nighttime journeys going, and it gently reassures the algorithm that you enjoy wandering through forgotten worlds. And if you're still with me for a moment, tell me where you're listening from. I read those comments like tiny stars on a map, each one marking another sleepy traveller somewhere in the world. Now take a slow breath in and let it fall away. Feel the quiet around you deepen, the way a courtyard feels after a gate swings shut and the street noise dissolves. Make yourself comfortable wherever you are and let the edges of your day soften. Let us drift backward into the lantern-lit centuries of Imperial China, where silk and secrecy moved together, and where some of the most quietly extraordinary financial lives in human history were lived by women whose names most dynasties never bothered to write down. You're standing at the edge of a city in the Tang dynasty, somewhere around the 7th century of the Common Era, and the first thing you notice is that everything has a wall. The empire itself has walls. The city has walls, the neighbourhoods inside the city have walls, and within those neighbourhoods, nearly every household of any standing is arranged around a courtyard that is itself enclosed, folded inward, its private life invisible from the street. This layering of enclosures was not incidental. It was the physical expression of a social philosophy, one that sorted human beings with enormous precision into categories of belonging. At the very top, the emperor, the son of heaven, his presence radiating outward through a vast bureaucracy of examinations and appointments. And at the very bottom, in a category that existed almost outside the official hierarchy entirely, a class of people classified broadly as entertainers, performers, and women who lived outside the protection of a recognized household. The walls that kept everyone else in also kept them out. And yet, as you will come to understand, those walls were far more porous than they appeared. Let's start with what we do know about how this world was structured, because the structure itself explains almost everything that came after it. Imperial Chinese society during the Tang dynasty operated according to a system that historians call the Four Occupations, a Confucian framework that ranked human activity into scholars at the top, then farmers, then artisans, then merchants. Below all four of these recognized categories existed a fifth layer that the official framework barely acknowledged: the mean people, or jianmin, a legal designation that included slaves, performers, and the women of the pleasure quarters. This designation was not simply social stigma, it was a legal status with real consequences. People classified as jianmen could not sit for the imperial examinations that were the primary pathway to official position and respectability. They could not marry into families of good standing without that family suffering a formal social penalty. Their children inherited their status, which meant that the category reproduced itself across generations with a cruel and self-sustaining efficiency. Think about that for a moment. A child born into this category entered the world already designated as someone whose labour, whose body, and whose earnings would exist in a space the state simultaneously taxed and refused to protect. And yet the state needed this world. The official banquets that cemented political relationships required entertainment. The examination culture that produced the bureaucratic class was saturated with a literary tradition that drew constantly on the imagery, the music, and the company of the pleasure quarters. The tax revenue generated by the entertainment districts of major cities was a consistent and significant line in the accounts of local governments across dynasty after dynasty. The walls existed, the designations existed, and behind them an entire parallel economy hummed with an energy and a sophistication that the official record spent considerable effort pretending not to see. You walk further into this city now, past the covered markets and the bell towers, past the great gates of the administrative quarter with their painted guardians, and you begin to notice something the maps do not always show you. There are streets that grow quieter as the official day ends. There are lanterns of a particular colour hanging above certain doorways. There is a smell of heated wine and sandalwood that drifts through certain alleys in the late afternoon, growing stronger as the sky above the rooftops shifts from pale gold to the deep blue of early evening. This is where the other economy begins, not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with the quiet, persistent fact of women counting their earnings by lamplight in a world that had carefully arranged itself so that no one important would have to think too hard about where the money came from. The social architecture of Imperial China was designed to make the invisible labour of certain women invisible, even while depending on it completely. Understanding that design is the first step toward understanding the lives of the women who navigated it, and the money they managed to keep. History has always had difficulty naming the women at the centre of this story without either romanticising them or erasing them entirely, and Imperial China was no different. The vocabulary alone is instructive, filled with layers of meaning that shift depending on the dynasty, the region, and the social position of whoever is doing the speaking. The most common term you encounter in Tang-era documents is ji, a word that carries the broad meaning of performer or entertainer, though its connotations ran a wide spectrum depending on context. There were women who sang in tea houses and were never expected to offer anything further. There were women kept in private households as concubines with a quasi-legal status and some measure of protection. There were women registered with the government as official entertainers, required to perform at state banquets and provide companionship to officials, their labour literally scheduled by clerks in municipal offices. And then there were women operating in the spaces between all of these categories in a kind of permanent legal ambiguity that gave them, paradoxically, a degree of freedom that more officially recognised women often did not possess. But here is where things get genuinely strange and worth pausing over. The vocabulary the Tang and Song dynasties used for these women was not a single word applied uniformly to a single experience. It was a constellation of terms, each carrying its own legal weight, its own social associations, its own implications for what a woman could own, could claim, and could become. The Yiji were official entertainers registered directly with government music bureaus, their performances a form of state-sanctioned culture production. The Changjia were women associated with the large urban entertainment establishments, the pleasure houses proper, whose business was more explicitly commercial. The Geiji were singing girls, whose primary skill was musical performance, and whose relationships with patrons could range from entirely transactional to something approaching genuine long-term companionship. The Yingji were camp entertainers, women who followed armies and were considered the very lowest tier of the profession. Each of these categories carried different earning structures, different legal vulnerabilities, and different possibilities for financial accumulation. And then there were the courtesans. The term is imprecise. Borrowed from European history and applied to Chinese women, it only partially fits, but it points towards something real. The upper tier of the entertainment world, women whose education, refinement, and social connections placed them in a category of recognized cultural prestige, even within a system that officially denied them respectability. These were the women whose names appeared in poetry. These were the women whose conversations with scholars were sometimes recorded and circulated. These were the women who, if circumstances aligned, could negotiate their way toward financial arrangements that bore more resemblance to a career than to simple exploitation. Think about that spectrum for a moment. At one end, a woman with no legal personhood, no ownership of her own labour, no name in any official record except the registration list of the Entertainment Bureau. At the other end, a woman whose verses were quoted by imperial officials, whose opinions on music and poetry were sought by the leading intellectuals of her era, and who had, through a combination of talent, calculation, and accumulated relationships, managed to carve out something that looked, in certain lights, like agency. The distance between those two positions was not fixed. It was traversable, under the right conditions, with the right combination of ability and luck, and ruthless financial management. Understanding the names, the categories, and what each one meant in practical terms is the foundation of everything else in this story. Because the name a woman carried in the administrative records of the Tang or Song dynasty was not just a label, it was a financial instrument, a limit on what she could claim and what the state could take from her. And the women who understood this, who grasped the legal geography of their own categorization, were the ones who found the narrow paths that the system had, largely by accident, left open. Every major city of the Tang and Song dynasties contained what historians now call the pleasure quarters, and the name, while imprecise, captures something true about the way these areas functioned as a world within a world. In the capital Chang'an, which was at the height of the Tang dynasty perhaps the largest and most cosmopolitan city on earth, the northern quarter near the Great Eastern Market contained an entire district of performance houses, wine shops, and establishments where women were paid to entertain. You can almost feel the texture of it as you drift through the historical record. The smell of heated wine and burning incense, the sound of a peeper being plucked somewhere behind a screen of silk, the flickering yellow light of oil lamps against whitewashed walls. These were not hidden places precisely. They appeared on city maps. Officials visited them openly. Poets wrote about them by name. And yet they existed in a kind of agreed-upon unreality, acknowledged by everyone and recorded by almost no one in any systematic way. Let us walk through this geography slowly, because the physical layout of these districts shaped the economic possibilities within them in ways that are easy to overlook. Chang'an was a planned city, laid out on a grid of 108 enclosed ward blocks, each surrounded by its own walls and gates that were locked at night. The entertainment districts, known variously as the Northern Ward or the Pingkang Ward, occupied a specific and deliberate position in this grid. They were close enough to the government quarter that officials could reach them easily. They were close enough to the great markets that wealthy merchants could find them without difficulty. And they were enclosed by their own internal geography. large established houses at the centre, smaller and less prestigious establishments along the outer lanes, tea houses and wine shops at the edges, where the quarter bled into ordinary commercial streets. This physical organisation was not accidental. It was a spatial expression of the same hierarchical logic that organised everything else in Tang society. The closer to the centre of the district, the more established and expensive the house. The more established and expensive the house, the more elaborate the training of the women within it, the more cultivated the entertainments on offer, and the higher the fees that could be charged to the patrons who climbed the lacquered stairs and settled onto the cushioned seats of the reception rooms. But here is what the maps do not show you, and what you can only understand by reading the poetry and the legal records together. Within this geography, women moved. They were not fixed to a single establishment for the entirety of their working lives. Some were sold or transferred between houses as their earning power fluctuated. Some managed, through accumulated savings or through the financial intervention of a patron, to move from a less prestigious establishment to a more prestigious one, a transition that could meaningfully change both their income and their social exposure. Some eventually established small operations of their own, in the outer lanes of the district, modest enough to avoid the attention of the larger houses, significant enough to generate a living. The Song dynasty city of Hangzhou, which a later traveller famously described as the finest city in the world, extended this geography onto the water. Pleasure boats moved along the canals that threaded through the city, floating entertainment venues where women performed music and poured wine for patrons who preferred their assignations to leave no fixed address. The mobility was literal. The financial implications of that mobility were real. A woman working on a boat was harder to register, harder to tax, and harder to control than one working in a licensed establishment on a known street. The pleasure quarters of Imperial China were not marginal spaces. They were woven into the fabric of urban life, their geography shaped by the same logic of status and access that organised every other part of the city. And within that geography, women with sufficient knowledge and sufficient resources found more room to manoeuvre than the official silence of the record suggests. One of the stranger revelations that emerges when you spend time with the historical record is that the imperial state did not merely tolerate the pleasure quarters, it actively administered them. Beginning in the Tang dynasty and continuing with increasing bureaucratic sophistication through the Song, Yuan, and Ming periods, local governments maintained official registers of women working as entertainers. These registers recorded names, physical descriptions, the establishment where a woman worked, and the fees she was expected to generate. The state then took its share, a practice that varied across dynasties but was never entirely absent. This created a peculiar situation in which women who existed outside respectable society were simultaneously inside the machinery of the state, their bodies and labour catalogued with the same clerical thoroughness applied to grain stores and tax receipts. And this official relationship, uncomfortable and exploitative as it was, also produced something historians can actually work with: paper, numbers, evidence, a faint paper trail through centuries that would otherwise be completely silent. And then, almost suddenly, the administration becomes more elaborate than you might have expected. The Tang government maintained a dedicated bureau for the management of official entertainers, an office staffed by clerks whose job included maintaining the registers, scheduling women for official performances, and ensuring that the fees generated by the industry flowed appropriately into the relevant accounts. The bureaucratic language of these records is remarkable in its blandness. Women appear in them as entries, identified by name, physical characteristics, assigned establishment, and assessed earning capacity. There is no moral commentary in the administrative record. There is only the column of figures, the periodic reassessments, and the notation of changes in status when a woman died, was transferred or was released from registration. This registration system served multiple functions simultaneously, not all of them obvious at first glance. For the state, the most important function was fiscal. The entertainment districts of major Tang and Song cities generated tax revenue that local governments depended on, revenue from fees paid by establishments for their licenses, revenue from the assessed earnings of registered women, revenue from the fines levied when regulations were violated. The scale of this revenue varied by city and dynasty, but it was consistent enough to become a standard line in local administrative budgets, which is precisely why the bureaucratic apparatus for managing it became so elaborate and so persistent. For the women themselves, registration had a more ambiguous meaning. On one hand, it was a mark of their exclusion from respectable society, a formal notation in the government's books that they occupied the lowest legal category. On the other hand, registration created a kind of official existence that entirely unregistered women lacked. A registered woman had a name in a government document. She could, in principle, appear before a magistrate if a patron refused to pay or a keeper withheld her earnings. The record of her assessed earning capacity created a baseline against which excessive extraction by a keeper could theoretically be challenged. None of this made the system just, but it made it navigable in ways that pure invisibility would not have permitted. The Song dynasty refined this administrative apparatus considerably. Song-era records from Hangzhou and other major cities show a more developed system of tiered registration, with different categories of establishments subject to different levels of official oversight and different rates of taxation. The most prestigious establishments, those catering to the official and scholarly classes, appear to have operated under a lighter regulatory touch than the more commercial houses lower down the social scale, a pattern that reflects the broader dynamic of the period. The state was more protective of the social spaces it valued than of the people who made those spaces function. What this administrative record tells us in the end is something simple and almost vertiginous in its implications. The pleasure quarters of Imperial China were not an informal underground economy operating on the margins of official life. They were a formally administered sector of the urban economy, managed, taxed, and regulated by the same bureaucratic apparatus that managed everything else. The women within that sector were, in the government's own accounting, productive economic units whose output was worth cataloguing and taxing. That the same government declined to extend them any of the rights normally associated with recognised economic participation is one of the defining ironies of their position. It is important to move slowly through this part of the story, because the routes that led a woman into the pleasure quarters of Imperial China were varied enough to resist any single explanation. Some women were sold into the life as children, purchased by brothel keepers or entertainment houses from families who could not feed them, a transaction that was illegal in some dynasties and common in nearly all of them. Some were the daughters of women already working in the industry, inheriting a status that attached itself to bloodlines in ways that were difficult to escape. Some were captured in wars or raids and found themselves in cities far from any family who might have claimed them. Some were widows who had lost the male protection on which respectable status depended and had no means of survival that did not pass through some form of officially disapproved labour. And a smaller number, documented carefully enough in certain Tang-era sources to be credible, entered the life by a kind of constrained choice, driven by poverty, yes, but also by the recognition that in certain narrow circumstances, the entertainment quarter offered a woman more mobility, more access to education, and more financial agency than the respectable household did. Let us start with what we do know about the most common pathway, because it sets the financial architecture of everything that follows. The purchase of a young girl by an entertainment house was the dominant mechanism by which women entered the industry during the Tang and Song dynasties. The transaction typically involved a formal agreement between the housekeeper and the child's family, usually recorded in some form of written contract. The family received a sum of money, the amount varying considerably based on the child's age, physical appearance, and the region of origin. This sum was immediately conceptualized not as a purchase price in the simple sense, but as a debt, the amount the child now owed the house for the investment that had been made in her. To that original sum would be added over the years the cost of her food, clothing, training, medical care, and any additional expenses incurred in the course of her development as an entertainer. Think about that structure for a moment. Before she had earned a single coin, a girl entering the entertainment quarter entered it already in debt, already carrying a financial obligation whose terms had been set entirely by others. The cost of formal training was not trivial. Learning to play the pipa or the zheng to a standard acceptable for performance at official functions required years of daily instruction from skilled musicians. Learning to sing in the classical modes required training of a comparable intensity. Calligraphy, the art of preparing and serving wine with the precise grace that elite patrons expected. The memorization of the poetic allusions that educated men dropped casually into conversation. All of this took time, required teachers, and was added to the growing column of debt in the house's ledger. But here is where the economics become genuinely complicated. This training was also an investment in the house's earning capacity, and the housekeeper understood that perfectly well. A woman who could compose a verse in response to a patron's literary challenge was worth significantly more per evening than one who could not. The investment was real. The debt was also real. And the tension between those two facts, between the house's genuine economic interest in the woman's development and the woman's genuine financial interest in eventually seeing some of the returns from that development, ran through the entire relationship between keeper and entertainer for the duration of their professional connection. The widow's path into the industry was different in character, but similar in financial outcome. A woman who had lost her husband in a society where female economic activity outside the household was barely recognized found herself in a position of acute vulnerability. If she had no adult sons, no cooperative family members, no property of her own that she could legally control, and no access to the labour markets that were open to men, the entertainment quarter was sometimes less a choice than an inevitability. These women entered the industry older and without the debt of purchase, but they entered it also without the training that made the upper tiers accessible, which meant they occupied the more commercial, less protected segments of the market, with fewer financial options and fewer socially powerful patrons to cultivate. Here is something the official histories rarely mentioned, and the popular imagination has largely forgotten. Many women in the upper tier of the pleasure quarters of Tang and Song China were among the most formally educated women in the country. This was not accidental. It was the economic logic of the industry made visible. A woman who could recite classical poetry, play the pipa, paint with ink, and compose witty responses to the literary games that educated men played at banquets was worth significantly more than one who could not. And so the houses that could afford it invested in training. Girls who'd been purchased young were taught calligraphy, music, dance, and the enormous body of classical allusion that underpinned Chinese literary culture. Some were taught to read, at a time when female literacy was vanishingly rare outside the imperial court. The effect of this investment was a tier of women whose intellectual cultivation sometimes exceeded that of the officials and scholars who visited them, a situation that produced a kind of charged social irony that the literature of the period is absolutely saturated with. But here is where things get genuinely interesting and worth slowing down to consider. The curriculum of an upper-tier entertainment house in Tangchang'an or Songhangzhou was not informal. It was structured, sequential, and taught by specialists who were themselves paid professionals. Music instruction came first and was considered foundational. The pipa, a 4-stringed lute of Central Asian origin, was the prestige instrument, capable of expressing both the melancholic and the joyful, with an emotional range that made it ideal for the long evenings of a banquet. The jeng, a zither with a gentler, more meditative sound, was associated with a more contemplative style of entertainment, suited to quieter and more intimate occasions. Mastery of either instrument to a performance standard took years. Mastery of both was the mark of a woman who had been invested in seriously. Poetry came alongside music, and it is difficult to overstate how central poetic exchange was to the social life of the Tang-educated class. The examination system that produced the imperial bureaucracy tested candidates intensively on their ability to compose verse in classical forms, and the men who passed those examinations carried that practice with them into their social lives. An evening in the pleasure quarter that did not involve poetry, that did not include the improvisation of verses, the completion of a rhyme sequence, or the witty deployment of literary allusion, was an evening that fell short of the cultural expectations of the class. A woman who could participate in these exchanges as a genuine literary peer, who could compose a fresh and technically accomplished response to a couplet offered by a drunken official, was providing something that had measurable social value for the patron and measurable financial value for the house. The transmission of this education was itself a social network. Established musicians taught in multiple houses. Scholars sometimes offered informal instruction to women who had cultivated their interest. Women who had retired from active entertaining occasionally returned as teachers, passing on both technical skills and the accumulated social intelligence of a career spent navigating the entertainment world. This created an informal but real educational infrastructure within the pleasure quarters, one that existed entirely outside the official institutions of learning and was entirely invisible to the historians who were, almost without exception, products of those official institutions. And then there were the subtler arts, the management of conversation, the precise social calibration of attention, the ability to make a patron feel uniquely seen and uniquely valued in a setting where 30 other women were attempting the same thing. These skills are harder to teach and harder to document, but the evidence of their cultivation is everywhere in the poetry of the period, in the way men wrote about particular women with an intensity that was clearly about more than physical attraction. It was about the experience of being genuinely engaged with, genuinely listened to, genuinely matched in intellectual exchange by someone who had every reason to perform attentiveness, but who had clearly gone considerably further. That going further was, among other things, a financial strategy. A patron who felt genuinely understood came back. A patron who came back became a source of sustained income, and a woman with multiple sustained sources of income was a woman who had options. Let us settle now into the financial details, because they are more interesting than you might expect, and they reveal a world that operated with considerable economic sophistication. A woman working in the entertainment quarter of a Tang or Song dynasty city earned money through several parallel streams simultaneously. There were the fees paid directly to the establishment for her time, usually set by the house and collected by the keeper, with the woman receiving a negotiated portion. There were gifts, which operated in a kind of parallel currency. Bolts of silk, lacquered boxes, ceramic vessels, lengths of fine cloth that could be converted to coin or stored as portable wealth. There were tips, called different things in different periods, that passed informally and were sometimes recorded and sometimes not. And then there were the longer-term financial arrangements, the patron relationships, the kept concubine agreements, the informal sponsorships that powerful men sometimes offered favoured women as a form of exclusive access. Each of these streams had its own customs, its own risks, and its own possibilities for accumulation. Let us start with the most basic layer, the fee structure, and work upward from there. The standard fee for a woman's company at a private banquet was calculated and collected by the house, not by the woman herself. The patron paid the house for the evening, and the house paid the woman a share of that fee according to whatever arrangement existed between them. In the Tang period, for which we have some administrative records, the state assessed women's earning capacity when registering them, and used those assessments as the basis for taxation, which means we have at least rough figures for what women at different tiers were expected to generate. A woman assessed at the higher end could command fees several times those of a woman at the lower end for the same length of engagement, a differential that reflected the value placed on education, refinement, and established reputation. But the official fee was only the beginning. The gift economy that operated alongside it was in many cases financially more significant. Silk was the most important gift currency of the Tang dynasty, a medium of exchange so standardized that bolts of it functioned almost like banknotes in certain kinds of large transaction. A patron who wished to demonstrate his appreciation without the coarseness of handing over coin would bring silk, lacquerware, fine ceramics, or lengths of expensive fabric, items whose monetary value was clear to everyone involved, but which maintained the fiction of romantic generosity rather than commercial transaction. These gifts were the woman's own property, not the house's, at least in principle, a distinction that mattered enormously for the accumulation of personal wealth. And here is where the financial sophistication becomes visible in a way that surprises. The women who navigated this gift economy successfully were not passive recipients. They managed it actively. They cultivated patrons who gave generously. They created the conditions for gift-giving through the careful management of emotional intimacy, through the timing of certain kinds of attention, through the strategic display of need or of pleasure at a previous gift. None of this was accidental, and the women who were most skilled at it were engaged in a form of relationship management that required the same combination of calculation and genuine emotional intelligence that distinguished any successful negotiator in any other economic context. The informal tip, passed directly from patron to woman during the course of an evening, existed in a grey zone between the official fee economy and the gift economy. It was money that the house could not easily track or claim, which made it one of the most important forms of income for a woman seeking to accumulate personal savings beyond what the formal fee-sharing arrangement permitted. The management of this informal stream, the cultivation of patrons who tipped generously, and the graceful management of those who did not, was a skill in its own right, one that the record captures only obliquely, but whose importance is implied by how frequently it appears in the background of legal disputes between women and their keepers. The woman at the centre of this story did not, in most cases, work independently. She worked within a system, and that system had a keeper at its head, a figure known in various periods by various terms, but whose role was remarkably consistent across the dynasties. She was the manager, the investor, the creditor, and in many cases the original purchaser. The keeper, who was very often a woman herself, frequently a former entertainer who had accumulated enough resources to buy and manage others, held the financial architecture together. She had typically paid for the purchase of the women in her house, for their training and clothing and food, and she tracked all of this as debt, a debt that the women in her establishment were expected to earn their way out of through their labour. This system created a kind of permanent financial obligation that could be manipulated, extended, and in the worst cases, made essentially unpayable. But it also created, in certain circumstances, a relationship that was more negotiated than simple ownership, one in which a woman who generated enough income could accumulate leverage of her own. Think about that word, leverage, and what it meant in this specific context. A keeper's financial interest in the women she managed was straightforward. She needed them to generate income that exceeded the costs of maintaining them, ideally by a substantial margin. This interest created an incentive for the keeper to maintain the earning capacity of her establishment, which meant keeping her most valuable women healthy, well-dressed, musically current, and socially well-connected. In a system where a woman's most important financial asset was her reputation among the patrons of the quarter, the keeper had a direct financial stake in that reputation's maintenance, which gave a high-earning woman a degree of leverage over her keeper that the formal debt relationship obscured but could not entirely eliminate. The debt itself was the central mechanism of control, and it functioned in ways that would be familiar to historians of other debt bondage systems across cultures and eras. The original purchase price formed the principle. Training costs were added. Clothing, food, and medical care were added. Any advance payment to the woman's family for extraordinary needs was added. The interest, if explicitly calculated, made the total grow faster than it could realistically be repaid. And the keeper had considerable discretion over the accounting, which meant that a woman who was productive but whom the keeper wished to retain indefinitely could find her debt somehow never quite fully discharged. But the system also had pressures running in the opposite direction, and this is where it becomes more interesting than a simple story of exploitation. The labour market within the entertainment quarter was competitive. Patrons chose where to spend their evenings. A house whose women were unhappy, poorly maintained, or openly resentful of their keeper tended to lose business, slowly but surely, to establishments that offered a better atmosphere. The quarter had its own reputation economy, and within that economy, a keeper who was known for fair dealing, who honoured her agreements with the women in her house and allowed productive women to eventually settle their debts, attracted better talent and retained it longer than one who did not. The Song Dynasty records contain scattered but real evidence of women who successfully negotiated the repayment of their purchase debts and transitioned out of formal obligation to their keepers, either into independent operation or into a patron-supported arrangement that bypassed the house entirely. These transitions required both accumulated savings and a social network of patrons who could vouch for the woman's independence and provide the continuing income she would need to sustain herself outside the house structure. They were not common, but they were not vanishingly rare either, and their existence tells us something important about the system. It was exploitative, yes, but it was not entirely sealed. Across all dynasties and all tiers of the industry, the most economically significant relationship a woman in the pleasure quarters could form was with a patron, and the history of these relationships is a history of enormous financial complexity dressed in the language of romance. A patron was typically a man of some means, an official, a scholar, a merchant, sometimes a wealthy landowner, who developed a sustained relationship with a particular woman that went beyond a single transactional visit. He might visit regularly over months or years. He might give gifts on festivals and anniversaries. He might compete with other patrons for a woman's preference in ways that the entertainment quarter culture formalized into an elaborate social game. The economics underneath all of this sentiment were stark. A woman with multiple active patrons was generating income from several sources simultaneously, with some degree of competition among them that kept each from withdrawing too abruptly. But here is where the story becomes genuinely layered and worth moving through slowly. The Tang dynasty produced an entire literary genre built around the patron relationship. Known loosely as the Chuanqi or classical tale tradition, these short prose narratives returned again and again to the story of a young scholar and a talented entertainer, their relationship complicated by the scholar's poverty, the woman's obligations to her house, the interference of wealthy rivals, and the social impossibility of the connection's formalization. The genre is so consistent in its preoccupations that historians have read it as a kind of cultural processing of the anxieties the patron system generated. The men writing these stories were men who knew the pleasure quarters well. They were working through something real. What they were working through, in part, was the financial asymmetry of the relationship and the uncomfortable ways in which it ran in both directions. A wealthy patron had obvious power. He could afford gifts that a poorer visitor could not. He could pay the house for exclusive access to a particular woman's time. He could in some circumstances offer to purchase a woman out of her debt entirely, a transaction that transformed him from patron to owner and her from entertainer to concubine. But a woman with multiple wealthy patrons competing for her preference held a different kind of power, the power of allocation. She decided within the constraints of her house's bookings how much time and attention she directed toward each patron. She decided which gifts she acknowledged with particular warmth and which she received with pleasant neutrality. She managed the emotional thermostats of multiple relationships simultaneously, keeping each patron engaged without allowing any single one to feel so confident of his position that he stopped trying. This management was exhausting. The surviving poetry and prose from the period, particularly the work attributed to women of the entertainment quarter, contains enough imagery of weariness and strategic calculation to suggest that the emotional labour of the patron system was experienced as labour, not as natural feminine behaviour. But it was also, for women who did it skillfully, the primary engine of financial advancement in a system that offered very few other engines. The kept concubine arrangement represented the highest value version of the patron relationship, and also its most financially precarious form. A patron who agreed to support a woman exclusively, removing her from the general entertainment market and establishing her in a private residence at his expense, was providing income security that the open market could not match. He was also creating a situation of total financial dependence on a single individual whose circumstances could change, who might be posted to a distant province, whose primary wife might succeed in having the arrangement dissolved, who might simply lose interest. The women who entered these arrangements knowing this did so with clear eyes, and the historical record contains enough evidence of women who managed these transitions gracefully, and enough of women who were left with nothing to suggest that the outcome depended heavily on what the woman had managed to save and secure before the arrangement ended. Now comes one of the most fascinating questions, and one of the hardest to answer cleanly. What did women in the pleasure quarters actually do with the money they earned? The direct evidence is fragmentary, scattered across legal cases, literary accounts, and occasional administrative records, but it points in several consistent directions. Clothing and jewellery were the most visible form of wealth storage, and they served a dual purpose. They advertised earning power to potential patrons while simultaneously functioning as portable assets that could be liquidated in an emergency. Property was a more ambitious form of investment, and there are documented cases from the Song dynasty of women who had managed to purchase the houses in which they worked, shifting from labourer to owner in a single transaction that permanently altered their financial position. Loans and money lending appear in the record as well, often in formal arrangements in which a woman with accumulated capital lent to others within the quarter at interest, becoming a creditor within a world that had treated her almost entirely as a debtor. Let us start with the most basic and most human response to earning money in a precarious situation, the imperative to make it invisible. A woman working in the entertainment quarter of a Tang or Song dynasty city who accumulated savings faced a practical problem that had nothing to do with investment strategy and everything to do with security. She had no bank. She had no legal right to own property in most of the standard forms. She had a keeper who maintained significant financial oversight over her affairs and a considerable interest in knowing what the woman was worth. And she lived in close proximity to other people, some of whom were not above taking what was not theirs. The question of where to keep money was not abstract. It was urgent and immediate. The answer, for most women, involved a combination of physical concealment and the conversion of coin into forms that were easier to hide and less obviously identifiable as accumulated savings. Coins sewn into the hems of garments. Small amounts of silver converted into decorative hairpins that could be worn daily without attracting comment. Lengths of fine silk folded into the bottom of a storage chest beneath ordinary clothing, their value known to the woman but invisible to anyone who did not know what they were looking at. The archaeological record of Tang and Song China contains a persistent pattern of small hoards, collections of coin, and portable luxury goods found in domestic contexts that suggest this practice of distributed concealment was widespread. Jewellery occupied a special position in this economy of concealment because it existed simultaneously in several registers. Worn in public, it was display, an advertisement of the woman's earning capacity and the quality of her patron relationships. Stored in a box, it was savings, portable, dense in value, universally understood as convertible to coin in a market that ran on the exchange of luxury goods. Given to a trusted person outside the quarter for safekeeping, it was a form of off-site banking, a hedge against the loss of everything through fire or theft, or a keeper's sudden demand for repayment of an inflated debt. The Song dynasty records offer the clearest windows into property ownership, and what they show is more interesting than the general invisibility of these women in the official record would lead you to expect. There are documented cases of women who held formal title to the premises they occupied, having purchased them from previous owners through arrangements that were legally recognised even if socially anomalous. There are cases of women who held loans secured against real property, functioning as creditors in the city's informal financial markets. There are cases of women who had accumulated sufficient capital to invest in the equipment and licensing fees of their own small entertainment operations, transitioning from worker to proprietor through a series of carefully managed financial steps that the record captures only in fragments, but whose logic is clear. These were not the majority. For most women in the pleasure quarters, the financial reality was extraction without accumulation, labour without savings, a life that ended in poverty without the cushion of any property that might have softened it. But the minority who managed otherwise tells us something about the system's internal architecture that simple despair does not. There were seams in the structure, narrow passages between the stones, and the women who found them had done something genuinely remarkable. The Tang dynasty is sometimes described by historians as the golden age of Chinese poetry, and it is also, not entirely coincidentally, the period in which the relationship between the literary world and the entertainment quarters was at its most intense and most thoroughly documented. Scholars studying for the imperial examinations, officials posted to provincial capitals, poets building reputations in the capital, all of these men moved through the entertainment quarters with a frequency that the surviving literature makes impossible to deny. And the women they spent time with were not passive recipients of literary attention. They were, in many cases, literary participants. There are surviving poems attributed to women of the entertainment quarters from the Tang dynasty that are anthologized alongside the work of the most celebrated male poets of the same era. These women composed verse, responded to verse, and engaged in the formal poetry games that were a central feature of the educated social world. This cultural participation was not separate from the financial economy of the quarters. It was one of its primary engines. Let us start with what we do know about how poetry and money move together in the Tang world, because the connection is tighter than it might first appear. The imperial examination system, which was the primary pathway to official appointment and social advancement in Tang China, tested candidates on their ability to compose regulated verse in strict classical forms. A man who passed the Jinshi examination, the highest and most competitive level, was expected to be a skilled poet. Poetry was not a hobby of the educated class. It was the medium through which the educated class performed its identity, conducted its relationships, and demonstrated its fitness for the cultural world of the capital. When these men entered the entertainment quarters of Chang'an and Luoyang, they brought that expectation with them. An evening that did not involve the composition and exchange of verse was an evening that had not fully delivered what the educated patron had come for. A woman who could meet that expectation was worth considerably more than one who could not. The financial mechanics of this cultural exchange were straightforward, but often disguised in the language of aesthetic appreciation. A patron who was moved by a woman's verse did not typically hand her coin in direct payment for the poem. He sent silk the following morning. He returned within the week with a gift of lacquerware. He mentioned her name to a colleague who might become a new patron. He included lines referencing her in his own published verse, which circulated in manuscript form among the educated class, and functioned as a form of public endorsement that could meaningfully increase her earning capacity. The financial value of literary reputation was real, and the women who understood this invested in their reputations with the same deliberateness that a merchant invested in the quality of his goods. The poetry games that structured many entertainment quarter evenings had a financial dimension embedded in their social form. A game in which patrons composed verses and the woman responded required her to hold her own in real time without preparation in front of an audience of men whose literary judgment was both their professional credential and their primary social currency. A woman who failed at this, who offered flat or technically clumsy responses, risked losing the room in a way that had lasting consequences for her standing in the quarter. A woman who excelled, who produced a response that was technically accomplished and also genuinely witty, who understood the illusion being offered and returned it with an illusion of her own that the patron had not anticipated, acquired something that circulated through the literary networks of the capital, independently of her physical presence, a reputation for brilliance that brought new patrons to her door without her having to seek them. This was, in the most precise sense, the cultivation of her intellectual capital as financial strategy, and it worked well enough that the Tang literary record preserves the names of women who employed it successfully, women whose verses were copied and circulated among the educated class of a civilization of 60 million people, not because their social position entitled them to that circulation, but because the quality of their work demanded it. Across all dynasties and all tiers of the industry, the most economically significant relationship a woman in the pleasure quarters could form was with a patron, and the history of these relationships is a history of enormous financial complexity dressed in the language of romance. History being what it is, the women from the pleasure quarters who are most visible to us now are the exceptional ones, the women whose stories were dramatic enough, or whose connections were powerful enough to generate documentation that survived the long erosion of the centuries. Xue Tao, who lived in the late Tang dynasty in the city of Chengdu, was a poet whose work was collected and circulated during her own lifetime, a recognition almost unheard of for a woman of her social position. She was officially classified as an entertainer, registered with the local government, required to perform at official functions. She was also widely regarded as one of the finest poets of her generation, and she conducted a famous correspondence with some of the most celebrated literary figures of the age. Her economic life was therefore interwoven with her literary reputation in ways that made the two almost impossible to separate. Her fame generated income, and her income gave her the stability to generate more fame. But here is where things get genuinely interesting, and worth moving through carefully. Xue Tao's story begins in displacement. Her father was a minor official who died when she was still young, leaving her and her mother without the male household head, on whom respectable status depended. She was registered as an entertainer in Chengdu, likely in her early teens, a transition that the Tang administrative machinery processed with the same bureaucratic neutrality it applied to everything else. What happened next is the part the official record does not fully explain, but the literary record makes legible. She became, within a remarkably short span of years, one of the most sought-after literary companions in a city that was a significant regional cultural centre. She was summoned repeatedly to the official residence of Wei Gao, the military governor of Sichuan, one of the most powerful officials in the Western Territories. She accompanied him to official functions. She composed verse at his request on public occasions. She was, in practical terms, operating as a cultural asset of the regional administration, a status that provided her with a degree of social protection and financial stability that the standard registration system would not have generated. What Xuetao did with that position is instructive. She did not spend her earnings on conspicuous display. The record, which includes her poems and scattered references in the writing of her contemporaries, suggests a woman who invested in her intellectual life, who continued to read and study and refine her craft through the decades of her active career. She developed a distinctive small-format paper for correspondence, known to later historians as Xuetao paper, that became sought after as a luxury item among the literary class. This was, if you read it carefully, a commercial venture embedded in a cultural practice. She created a branded product associated with her own reputation that generated income through its circulation among the networks of educated men who valued her name. She was, in other words, running something that in a later economic vocabulary we might call a personal brand, a deliberate cultivation of her own cultural identity as an income-generating asset. That she did this from within the constraints of the entertainment registration system, without the legal standing to own property in standard forms, without the institutional support of any recognised scholarly community, makes it more remarkable, not less. She retired in her later years to a small house in Chengdu, took minor religious vows, and lived quietly until her death. She left behind 500 poems and a name that the literary tradition could not entirely suppress, even when it tried. The Song dynasty, which ran roughly from the 10th to the 13th century, was one of the most commercially sophisticated societies the world had yet produced. Paper money was invented and deployed at scale. Long-distance trade networks connected coastal cities to markets in Southeast Asia and the Islamic world. A prosperous merchant class accumulated wealth that sometimes exceeded that of the old aristocracy. And within this expansion of commercial culture, the pleasure quarters expanded and diversified with remarkable speed. This song saw the development of a tiered entertainment economy more elaborate than anything the Tang had produced. Floating pleasure boats on urban waterways, specialised establishments catering to different price points and preferences, performance venues that functioned almost like theatres, while also functioning as places where longer arrangements could be negotiated. The commercial logic of the Song dynasty seeped into every corner of this world, and women who understood that logic, who could manage their own earnings with the same sophistication that a merchant brought to his inventory, found real possibilities for financial advancement. Let us start with the broader commercial transformation, because it is the context that makes everything else in this segment comprehensible. The Song dynasty's economic revolution was not simply a matter of more trade and more money. It was a revolution in financial instruments and commercial practice that changed the texture of daily economic life in ways that touched even the most marginal participants in the urban economy. Paper money, first issued in Sichuan in the early 11th century and eventually standardized across the empire, made large transactions more portable and created a more fluid commercial environment in which the velocity of exchange increased dramatically. Credit instruments, warehouse receipts, and early forms of commercial paper circulated among the merchant class. creating a financial infrastructure more sophisticated than anything that had existed in the Tang period. The entertainment quarter existed inside this transformed economy, and it absorbed the transformation. The floating pleasure boats of Hangzhou and other major Song cities represent one of the most distinctive developments of the period, and their financial implications are worth lingering over. These vessels, which range from relatively modest wine boats to elaborate multi-decked pleasure craft that could accommodate dozens of guests, operated outside the fixed geography of the land-based entertainment district. They were harder to register, harder to tax with precision, and harder for housekeepers to monitor than establishments with fixed addresses. A woman working on a boat was operating in a space where the standard debt and accounting relationships of the house system were more difficult to enforce, which created genuine opportunities for the accumulation of personal earnings that bypassed the keeper's ledger. The expansion of the merchant class also introduced a new category of patron into the entertainment quarter, one with different characteristics from the scholar official patrons who had dominated the Tang-era system. Song merchants were wealthy in ways that often exceeded the incomes of middle-ranking officials, but they occupied a lower position in the formal social hierarchy and were more acutely conscious of that gap. Many invested heavily in the cultural practices associated with the educated class, attending the entertainment quarter not only for pleasure, but for the social proximity to scholars and officials that the quarter provided. For women skilled at navigating these social dynamics, the arrival of merchant patronage created a larger pool of potential financial relationships and, more importantly, a diversified pool, one not entirely dependent on the political fortunes of the official class. The commercial sophistication of the Song period also made it more possible for women with accumulated capital to invest it productively. The credit markets that had developed to serve the merchant class were accessible, under certain conditions, to anyone with coin and a reliable social network. A woman who had saved enough to make a significant loan could enter those markets as a lender, earning interest on capital that the house system had not managed to extract entirely. The evidence for this practice is fragmentary, but it is real, scattered across Song-era legal records in the form of disputes over unpaid loans that name women of the entertainment quarter among the creditors. The relationship between a woman and the house in which she worked was in most dynasties formalized through some kind of written agreement, and these documents, where they survive, are among the most revealing windows into the financial architecture of the pleasure quarters. The agreements typically specified the duration of service, the division of earnings between the woman and the keeper, the conditions under which the debt incurred by the woman's purchase and training could be repaid, and the penalties for various kinds of breach. The language of these contracts is almost always the language of commerce. Debts owed, services rendered, accounts settled. What they also reveal, obliquely, is the space for negotiation that existed within the system. Not every woman signed these documents in ignorance of their terms. Some negotiated clauses, some sought witnesses, some contested them afterward in the local magistrate's court, generating the legal records that tell us more about the practical reality of these women's lives than almost any other source. Think about that for a moment. A woman with no formal legal standing, classified by the state as among the lowest category of persons, appearing before a magistrate to contest the terms of a contract. That this happened at all is remarkable. That it happened often enough to leave a consistent pattern in the legal record is extraordinary. The contracts themselves varied considerably by region, dynasty, and the tier of the house involved. At the most basic level, a simple agreement might record little more than the purchase price paid for a girl, the name of the house, and a general statement of the labour obligations being assumed. At a more developed level, particularly in the Song and Ming dynasties where commercial documentation had become more sophisticated, contracts might specify the exact percentage of fees the woman was entitled to retain, the categories of expense that could legitimately be added to her debt account, the festivals and rest periods she was entitled to, and the procedure by which her debt could be formally discharged upon full repayment. The existence of these detailed provisions tells us something important. There were enough disputes about these matters, enough women challenging keeper accounting, and enough keepers defending their practices before magistrates that it became useful to specify the terms in writing with some precision. The contract was a response to conflict as much as a cause of it, an attempt to reduce the legal uncertainty of a relationship that both parties understood could become adversarial. The magistrates' court records from the Song dynasty, which survive in greater numbers than those of any earlier period, contain a recurring category of case that historians of Chinese women's history have found particularly valuable: disputes between women of the entertainment quarter and their keepers over debt calculations, fee divisions, and the conditions of debt discharge. These cases are not dramatic. They involve small sums, contested accounting entries, disagreements over whether a particular item of clothing was a gift to the woman or a house expense to be added to her debt. But their very mundanity is the point. They reveal a world in which women were sufficiently aware of their financial positions, sufficiently confident of the existence of at least minimal legal recourse, and sufficiently willing to accept the social exposure of a court appearance to contest the numbers when they believed the numbers were wrong. This willingness to contest, to appear before authority and argue a position, is a form of financial agency that the standard narrative of these women's lives tends to obscure. It was not heroic, it was practical, and it was, in the specific context of a system designed to extract maximum value from women with minimum accountability to them, a form of resistance whose importance should not be underestimated. One of the more peculiar aspects of the pleasure quarter economy in the Tang and early Song dynasties was the existence of a system in which women were required to perform entertainment duties for state functions, almost as a form of tax. Women registered with the local entertainment bureau could be summoned to official banquets, sent to welcome visiting dignitaries, or required to perform at seasonal ceremonies. They were not paid by the state for this service in any regular way, though gifts were expected and apparently common. The system sat in uncomfortable relation to the other dimensions of these women's working lives, because it simultaneously increased their visibility and their prestige, exposing them to a wider range of wealthy and powerful contacts, while also consuming time that might otherwise have been spent generating income through their own arrangements. Women who were summoned regularly to high-level official functions occupied a strange dual position: recognized enough by the state to be drafted into its ceremonies, yet denied by that same state any of the legal protections available to women of recognized social standing. And yet, here is where the situation becomes more nuanced than a simple story of compelled labour. The official banquet circuit of the Tang dynasty was the primary social networking environment of the imperial bureaucracy. It was where officials cultivated relationships with superiors, demonstrated their cultural accomplishments to peers, and observed the social calibration of rivals. The women summoned to perform at these events were not invisible servants. They were active participants in the social theatre of the occasion, required to engage with the officials present, to respond appropriately to their conversational initiatives, and in many cases to participate in the literary games and musical performances that were the formal content of the evening. A woman who performed well in this environment, who was noticed by a senior official or a visiting dignitary, who was mentioned afterward in a letter or a poem that circulated among the educated class, had received something of genuine financial value, visibility among the most powerful patronage network in the empire. The gift economy at official functions operated at higher level than the gift economy of the ordinary entertainment house evening. Senior officials expected to give gifts appropriate to their station, which meant gifts of significant monetary value: silk, fine ceramics, and occasionally silver. A woman summoned repeatedly to the functions of a major regional official was accumulating gifts at a rate that could, if she managed them carefully, represent a meaningful contribution to her long-term savings. The compelled nature of her attendance did not eliminate the economic opportunity embedded in it. It merely meant that she had not chosen when and where the opportunity would arise. The relationship between official duty and personal financial opportunity created a complex set of incentives for women in the higher tiers of the registration system. Being known as a woman who performed well at official functions was itself a form of marketing. It signalled to private patrons that the woman had been deemed suitable for the most demanding social environments, that her conversational skills, musical abilities, and social judgment had met a standard set by the requirements of official culture. This endorsement, implicit and never formally stated, carried real weight in the private patron market and could translate into higher fees and more selective engagement with patrons, a degree of control over the terms of her work that women without this official visibility could not easily achieve. Not every woman in the pleasure quarters stayed. The historical record, patchy as it is, contains enough evidence of departure, flight, and reinvention to suggest that exit was a persistent preoccupation of the women who worked there, if not always an achievable one. The most common form of exit was marriage, specifically a particular category of secondary marriage in which a woman left the entertainment quarter to become a concubine in a household, acquiring a kind of legal personhood she had not previously possessed, along with access to whatever stability that household could provide. This was not always a straightforward improvement. Concubines occupied an ambiguous position in the household hierarchy, above servants but below the primary wife, with rights that varied enormously depending on the character of the household they entered. But it represented for many women a threshold between the uncertainty of the quarters and something more settled, and women who had accumulated savings and portable wealth were significantly better positioned to negotiate favourable terms for this transition. Let us start with the formal exit, the concubinage transition, before turning to the more irregular departures that the record also captures. The process by which a woman left the entertainment quarter to enter a private household as a concubine was, in most dynasties, a commercial transaction with a social veneer. The patron who wished to make this arrangement paid the housekeeper a sum that represented the remaining value of the woman's debt, either calculated from the original purchase price less accumulated earnings, or negotiated as a lump sum that both parties agreed to. This payment extinguished the house's claim on the woman and transferred whatever financial authority over her existed into the patron's hands. The woman herself was not formally a party to this negotiation, though the practical reality was that a woman who strongly resisted such an arrangement could make it difficult enough to complete that her preferences carried real weight in the outcome. The savings a woman had accumulated before this transition mattered enormously to her position within it. A woman who entered a new household with personal wealth, even if that wealth took the portable form of jewellery and silk rather than coin, had a degree of independence within the household that a woman arriving with nothing did not. Her personal property gave her the ability to make gifts, to maintain social relationships outside the household walls, and to sustain herself in the event that the patron's circumstances changed. The primary wife of the household understood this perfectly well, which is why disputes between primary wives and concubines over the latter's personal property appear so frequently in the legal record of every dynasty. The irregular departures, the flights and disappearances that the record occasionally surfaces tell a different story. Women who ran away from entertainment houses without settling their debts were, legally, fugitives from a commercial obligation, and housekeepers had legal recourse to pursue them. The Tang and Song legal codes both provided mechanisms for the recovery of runaway indentured labourers, and these mechanisms were used. but they required the keeper to know where the woman had gone, which meant that a woman who fled to a different city, who changed her name, who found shelter with a patron willing to provide the social cover of a new identity, had a reasonable chance of disappearing from the house's reach. The road out was narrow, but it existed, and the women who found it, by whatever combination of savings and planning and opportunistic timing, were making a statement about the limits of the system's grip that the system itself preferred not to acknowledge. Among the most economically significant figures in the history of the Chinese pleasure quarters is the woman who managed to navigate the transition from labourer to proprietor, from the woman being managed to the woman doing the managing. This transition was not common, but it was not unheard of, and in certain periods and regions it was documented frequently enough to suggest it was a recognised, if difficult, path through the system. The woman who became a keeper had typically spent years accumulating savings, building relationships with wealthy patrons, and developing the administrative knowledge needed to run an establishment. She had learned how credit worked, how to evaluate the earning potential of the women she would manage, how to negotiate with local officials for the licenses and registrations the business required. She had, in other words, received a comprehensive education in applied commerce, entirely outside any formal institution, through the sheer necessity of navigating a system designed to extract value from her. But here is where things get strange in a way that the standard historical narrative tends to pass over quickly. The woman who became a keeper did not leave the system. She moved to a different position within it. She became the person who maintained the debt ledgers, who negotiated with the city's entertainment bureau for her establishment's license, who purchased girls from families and added their costs to the opening entries of new accounts. She became, in other words, a participant in the same mechanisms that had shaped her own earlier life. The historical record does not tell us how women who made this transition thought about it. The literary record occasionally gestures toward the psychological complexity of the position, in stories and poems that describe keepers with a mixture of pragmatic respect and moral unease. But the financial logic of the transition is clear, and it tells us something about the system's architecture that is worth sitting with. The keeper's business required capital. A woman could not purchase girls, fit out a house, pay registration fees, and maintain the household through the initial period before income stabilized without access to a significant lump sum. Where did this capital come from? In some cases from accumulated personal savings. In some cases from the financial support of a patron who had an interest in the establishment's success, perhaps an official who wanted a well-run house close to his residence and was willing to provide the initial investment in exchange for favoured access. In some cases, from loans arranged through the informal credit networks of the entertainment quarter itself, in which women who had accumulated capital lent to women seeking to establish themselves as proprietors. This last possibility is the most interesting, because it describes an entirely internal capital market, a system in which the earnings generated by the entertainment quarter were recycled within it to fund its own expansion, with women functioning as both the labour input and the financial intermediaries. It is a picture of economic self-organisation that existed entirely outside the official financial institutions of the empire and that the official record almost never acknowledged directly. But the legal disputes it generated, the unpaid loans and contested interest calculations that occasionally surfaced in magistrates' courts, leave enough of a trace to confirm that it was real. The keeper who had risen through the system brought to her role a knowledge of its mechanics that no outside investor could match. She knew which patrons paid reliably and which did not. She knew which categories of entertainment were currently fashionable among the official class and which were declining. She knew how to read a potential purchase, how to assess the likely earning arc of a girl whose training she was considering funding. This knowledge was itself a form of capital, accumulated over years and not available for purchase at any price. Archaeologists and art historians working with the material culture of Tang and Song China have identified a pattern that is subtle but consistent. Certain categories of luxury portable goods appear with unusual frequency in contexts associated with the entertainment quarters and the women who work there. Fine ceramics, particularly the small, elegant vessels used for wine service. Lacquerware boxes of a size suitable for cosmetics or less visibly for storing coins. Jade ornaments, the kind that could be worn in public as jewellery and converted to currency in private. Bronze mirrors with elaborately cast backs, whose weight and material value are entirely independent of their function. These objects tell a financial story that the text record often obscures. They are the visible residue of an invisible economy, the material form taken by earnings that could not be safely kept as coin, the wealth of women who understood that in a world with no bank accounts and no inheritance rights, the safest place to store money was on your body or in a box small enough to carry when you needed to leave. Let us move slowly through the material record because it rewards careful attention. The Tang dynasty produced some of the finest ceramics in Chinese history, and a significant portion of that production was oriented toward the wine service culture of the entertainment quarter. The small glazed ewers and shallow cups used for heated wine at banquets were objects of considerable aesthetic value, their quality a signal of the establishment's prestige and the quality of the evening on offer. But they were also, for the women who received them as gifts, stores of value in a form that was both socially acceptable and financially meaningful. A collection of fine ceramics given by patrons over the course of a career represented a significant asset portfolio, one whose value was recognised in the gift markets of the city and could be converted to coin when circumstances required. Jade occupied an even more important position in this material economy because its value was both culturally deep-rooted and practically portable. Jade had been a prestige material in Chinese culture for millennia, associated with virtue, permanence, and social distinction. A jade ornament given by a patron carried all of those cultural associations, while also being small enough to wear daily, conceal easily, and transport without difficulty. The women who accumulated jade over the course of their careers were building a kind of savings account, whose entries were distributed across their bodies and their jewellery boxes, invisible to anyone who did not know what they were looking at. The bronze mirror deserves particular attention. Mirrors in Tang and Song China were cast objects of considerable weight and craftsmanship, their backs decorated with elaborate designs that identified their maker and quality. They were expensive enough to function as significant gifts, and common enough in the material culture of the entertainment quarter to appear frequently in both literary and archaeological contexts. A woman's mirror collection was, in the most literal sense, a reflection of her earning history, each mirror a record of a gift from a patron of sufficient means to give one, its quality a rough indicator of that patron's social position and financial generosity. A collection of fine mirrors was also a negotiable asset, recognisable to any merchant in the used goods markets that existed in every major Tang and Song city. The pattern across all of these material forms is consistent. The women of the upper entertainment tiers systematically converted transient cash earnings into durable portable objects whose value was culturally legible and commercially recoverable. This was not hoarding. It was a rational response to a financial environment in which conventional savings mechanisms were inaccessible, in which the primary threat to accumulated wealth was the keeper's accounting rather than external theft, and in which the ability to leave quickly with your assets intact was a contingency that any prudent woman kept in mind. The relationship between the official world of the imperial bureaucracy and the unofficial world of the pleasure quarters was one of the most sustained and productive hypocrisies in the history of human governance. Officials who spent their careers applying the Confucian moral framework to the regulation of public life were also, in very large numbers, regular visitors to the entertainment districts of the cities where they served. The poetry of the Tang dynasty is so saturated with references to visits to the quarters that it would be difficult to compile an anthology of the period's verse without including them. And yet these same officials were responsible for administering the registration systems that formally designated these women as outside respectable society, for collecting the taxes generated by the industry, and for adjudicating the legal disputes that arose within it. The result was a regulatory regime characterized by enormous practical tolerance and equally enormous official disapproval, a combination that served the state's financial interests while maintaining the social boundaries it needed. Think about that for a moment. The same man who in the morning processed the tax receipts from the Entertainment Bureau, who reviewed the registration lists and assessed the women's earning capacity for the year's levy, might in the evening be seated in one of those same establishments, composing verse with a woman whose name he had entered in his official ledger that morning. The cognitive distance required to maintain both of these positions simultaneously was apparently not difficult to achieve, and the literature of the period suggests it was not experienced as contradiction by most of the men involved. The official who visited the entertainment quarter was not, in the cultural framework of his time, doing something that was understood as inconsistent with his professional role. The Confucian moral tradition distinguished between the private behaviour of officials, which was subject to certain expectations of restraint but not to the same rigour as public conduct, and the public exercise of their official duties. The entertainment quarter existed in the category of private behaviour, a space where the official temporarily set aside his public identity and engaged as a social and literary participant. The women in that space were professionally committed to maintaining this fiction, to treating their official patrons as individuals rather than as office holders, and to keeping whatever passed between them in the category of private experience. This fiction served everyone's interests, at least in the short term. Officials were protected from the social consequences of conduct that their public role required them to officially disapprove. Keepers were protected from the kind of aggressive regulatory scrutiny that a more honest acknowledgement of the quarter's clientele might have generated. Women were protected to a limited degree by the implicit understanding that men of official status did not publicise conflicts with entertainers in ways that would require them to explain what they were doing there. The long-term consequence of this arrangement for the women involved was double-edged. The official patron's visits provided income and social visibility, and his continued patronage signalled to other potential patrons that the woman was worth visiting. But his official position also created a power asymmetry that was nearly impossible to challenge. A woman who had a legitimate financial grievance against an official patron, a gift promised and not delivered, a fee arrangement honoured by the house but not by the patron, had almost no realistic avenue of recourse. The same court that might have adjudicated a dispute with a private citizen would, in most cases, find ways to avoid ruling against a sitting official. The protection that official patronage provided was real, but entirely conditional on the official's continued goodwill. The Tang dynasty capital of Chang'an was, at its height in the 7th and 8th centuries, a city of perhaps 1 million people, and among them were substantial communities of foreigners, merchants and monks from Central Asia, Persia and the Byzantine Empire, envoys and adventurers from the kingdoms of Southeast Asia, traders moving along the land and sea routes of what we now call the Silk Road. This cosmopolitan reality touched the pleasure quarters in ways that the historical record hints at, repeatedly without quite stating directly. Foreign women appear in Tang literature with a frequency that suggests they were a recognised and sought-after presence in the entertainment districts. Women from Central Asia, Sogdian or Persian in origin, were specifically associated with a style of music and dance that was fashionable in educated Tang circles. Their presence created a subcategory within the entertainment economy, with its own price structure its own patrons, and its own possibilities for financial navigation in a world doubly unfamiliar to them. Let us start with the Sogdians, because they are the most thoroughly documented foreign presence in the Tang entertainment world, and their story illuminates the broader pattern. The Sogdians were a Central Asian people whose homeland lay in what is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, and they were among the most commercially active participants in the Silk Road trade networks of the first millennium. Sogdian merchants had established communities in Chinese cities as early as the 4th and 5th centuries, and by the Tang period, Sogdian families had been resident in Chang'an for generations. Their cultural contributions to Tang life were substantial. Sogdian music, featuring instruments like the pipa and the konghu, a kind of harp, had been absorbed into the Tang musical canon. Sogdian dance, characterized by a spinning style performed on a small raised platform, was a fashionable entertainment at official banquets. The women who performed this music and dance occupied a specific niche within the entertainment quarter, one whose foreign associations were part of its commercial appeal. For these women, the financial geography of the entertainment quarter was complicated by a layer of foreignness that created both opportunity and vulnerability. The opportunity was clear. The novelty premium that attached to foreign performance styles meant that a skilled Sogdian dancer or musician could command higher fees than a Chinese entertainer of comparable ability. The cultural difference was the product, and for patrons who valued cosmopolitan display, who wished to signal their familiarity with the wider world by appreciating its arts, that product carried genuine premium value. The vulnerability was equally clear. A woman far from any family network, without the social connections that even marginally supported Chinese women in the quarter, without access to the informal credit and mutual aid arrangements that women within the Chinese entertainment world had developed over generations, was more exposed to exploitation than her Chinese counterparts. Her options in the event of mistreatment were more limited. Her ability to establish the long-term patron relationships that provided financial stability depended on navigating a social world whose conventions she was learning from the inside, under pressure, without a map. And yet some of them managed it. The Tang record preserves enough references to Sogdian women who had established themselves with wealthy Chinese patrons, who appear in the poetry of the period as recognized figures with names and social presence, to suggest that the double foreignness of their position, cultural and legal simultaneously, was not an absolute barrier to financial advancement within the quarter's economy. The Silk Road that had brought them to Chang'an was itself a system for navigating between worlds, and the women who had travelled it, or descended from those who had, brought with them a practical familiarity with that kind of navigation. For most of the Tang and Song dynasties, the official posture toward the pleasure quarters was one of regulated tolerance, a practical acknowledgement that the industry existed, generated revenue, and served social functions that the state preferred not to examine too carefully. The Ming dynasty, which came to power in the late 14th century after a period of Mongol rule, brought with it a more systematically moralistic approach to social regulation, and the pleasure quarters were among the targets of its reforming attention. The founder of the Ming dynasty issued edicts restricting official access to the entertainment quarters in terms more explicit than those of any previous dynasty. Enforcement was inconsistent, as it almost always is when official prohibition collides with deep social practice. But the regulatory shift had real consequences for the women working within the system, reducing some of the protections that official registration had previously offered, while simultaneously increasing the stigma attached to the work. Let us start with what changed, and then sit with what those changes actually meant for the women living inside them. The Ming founder, the Hongwu Emperor, was a man of unusual origins for a dynastic founder. He had been born into a family of tenant farmers in one of the poorest regions of central China, had spent part of his youth as a beggar and a wandering monk after his family was destroyed by famine, and had risen to power through decades of military leadership during the final collapse of Mongol rule. His social vision for the dynasty he established was shaped by this background in ways that distinguished it sharply from the aristocratic and commercially sophisticated cultures of the Tang and Song. He was suspicious of merchants, suspicious of luxury, and deeply suspicious of the cosmopolitan urban culture that the entertainment quarters represented. His edicts restricting official access to the quarters were not merely practical administrative decisions. They were expressions of a social ideology that valued agricultural simplicity over urban sophistication and Confucian moral rigour over the flexible tolerance of earlier periods. But here is where the history becomes genuinely complicated and worth moving through slowly. The Hongwu Emperor's moral campaign against the entertainment quarters was not, in practice, a campaign to abolish them. The Ming state continued to register entertainers, continued to tax the industry, and continued to summon women for official performances when occasion required. What changed was the social framing of official involvement. Earlier dynasty officials had visited the entertainment quarters with a frankness that the literary record preserves without apparent embarrassment. Ming officials who did the same increasingly did so with a consciousness of official disapproval that altered the social texture of the transaction, even when the transaction itself continued unchanged. For the women working within the system, this shift in social framing had tangible financial consequences. The implicit protection that official patronage had previously provided, the understanding that a man of official status didn't publicize conflicts with entertainers in ways that would require him to acknowledge his presence there, became less reliable when that same official now had a stronger professional incentive to distance himself from the quarter entirely. A patron who feared that his visits might become a liability was a patron whose gifts grew more cautious, whose visits grew less frequent, and whose willingness to intervene on a woman's behalf in disputes with her keeper grew more limited. The Ming period also saw a gradual erosion of the formal registration system that had, paradoxically, provided women in the industry with their minimal legal visibility. As official ideology moved toward a position of greater disapproval, the administrative apparatus that maintained the registers became less consistent in its operation. Women in the entertainment quarter during the Middle and Late Ming period existed in a legal space that was simultaneously more stigmatized and less formally administered than it had been under the Tang and Song, a combination that reduced their already limited access to legal recourse while doing nothing to reduce the economic extraction to which they were subject. What did not change, and what the historical record makes abundantly clear, was the practice itself. The entertainment quarters of Ming dynasty cities were populous, commercially active, and culturally significant throughout the period. The poets and painters of the late Ming produced some of the most intimate and carefully observed portraits of entertainment quarter life in all of Chinese literary history, a flowering of cultural attention to these women and their world that occurred precisely during the period when official ideology was most insistently looking the other way. The gap between what the Ming state said about the entertainment quarters and what actually happened within them was not an oversight. It was the system working exactly as it had always worked, with the added layer of a moral vocabulary that everyone understood was not intended to be taken entirely literally. There is a subset of Tang and Song poetry that historians of women's economic history have begun to read in an entirely new way, not as love poetry or erotic verse, but as a kind of encrypted financial record. The conventions of this poetry are so formalized, so committed to the language of flowers and seasons and moon and wine, that it is easy to read them as purely aesthetic exercises. But embedded within these conventions are references to gifts given and received, to debts acknowledged and forgiven, to relationships beginning and ending and being renegotiated, that function as a parallel accounting of the exchanges taking place between the women who composed or inspired the verse and the men who read and circulated it. A poem about a woman waiting by a lamp is also, often, a poem about a patron who has stopped coming. A poem about receiving a bolt of silk is also a record of a transaction. Read in this way, the literary output of the entertainment quarters becomes something stranger and more valuable than a collection of beautiful sentiments. It becomes an archive. And then, almost suddenly, you begin to see the numbers hiding inside the flowers. The regulated verse forms of Tang dynasty poetry were not merely aesthetic containers. They were social instruments, and their conventions encoded information about relationships and their status with a precision that the people who used them understood perfectly, even when later readers lost the key. The imagery of the plum blossom in winter, which appears so frequently in verse, attributed to or associated with women of the entertainment quarter, carried associations that its original audience would have read immediately. Resilience, isolation, beauty maintained under conditions of cold indifference, value recognized only by those who made the effort to look closely. These were not accidental choices. They were self-descriptions, composed by women who knew exactly what they were saying, and who chose the language of flowers to say it, because the language of flowers was the only medium available to them that would be preserved, circulated, and read. The gift poem, a form in which a poet composes verse to accompany or acknowledge a gift, is among the most financially revealing genres in the Tang literary corpus. These poems name objects, silks and ceramics, and mirrors and hairpins, with a specificity that transforms them from aesthetic backdrops into inventory. A poem composed to accompany the gift of a particular style of hairpin tells you not only that the gift was given, but that the giver knew the recipient well enough to select something specific, that the relationship had reached a stage of sufficient intimacy to warrant the expenditure a fine hairpin represented, and that both parties understood the poem itself as a record of the transaction, a receipt dressed in the language of affection. The poems of parting and separation that constitute a significant portion of the entertainment quarter literary corpus are particularly rich in this kind of embedded financial information. A poem written as a patron departs for a posting in a distant province is also, read carefully, a renegotiation of the financial arrangement between them. Will he continue to send gifts from his new post? Will he return? Will he remember the debt, financial and emotional, that the poem is quietly calling his attention to? The conventions of the genre required certain reassurances of continued devotion, and the convention itself was a mechanism, a way of placing on record in a form that would circulate and be read by others in their social world, that the patron had made certain commitments. Women who composed these poems were not simply expressing emotion, they were managing information. They were creating a shared understanding among readers of the manuscript networks through which the poems circulated, of what had passed between them and their patrons, and of what was owed. In a world without contracts that women could easily enforce, the poem was sometimes the closest available substitute for a legally binding record. We cannot tell this story honestly without sitting quietly for a moment with its less romantic dimensions. The financial strategies available to women in the pleasure quarters, however ingenious, operated within constraints that were severe, and the consequences of those constraints are visible in the record if you know where to look. The most fundamental constraint was time. The earning power of a woman in the entertainment quarters was closely tied to her youth, and the economic arc of most careers in the industry moved steeply downward after a woman's mid-30s. The strategies that worked when she was earning at her peak, accumulating jewellery, cultivating patrons, building toward a possible transition to concubinage or proprietorship, required consistent execution over years, and many women did not manage this, either because the system extracted too much from them too efficiently, or because the instabilities of life under the dynasties, wars, famines, administrative disruptions intervened before the plan could fully unfold. Think about that for a moment. The window during which the financial strategies we have been describing were available was narrow. A girl purchased young and trained through her early adolescence might begin earning significantly in her mid-teens. She had, in the best circumstances, perhaps 15 to 20 years during which her youth and established reputation combined to generate the kind of income that made accumulation possible. After that window closed, the options contracted with a speed that the literary record, which tends to focus on the successful and the celebrated, somewhat obscures. The poems of autumn, another persistent motif in the entertainment quarter literary tradition, carried a specific and understood meaning for the women who composed them. Autumn was the season of declining, the moment when things that had been full began to empty. A woman writing about autumn in her late 30s or early 40s was writing about her own economic position with an honesty that the flower imagery made bearable and the season made inevitable. The patrons who had visited regularly when she was new to the quarter were now visiting younger women. The gifts had slowed. The keeper's accounting had become less forgiving as the woman's earning capacity declined and the cost of her maintenance remained the same. The women who had managed their peak years well, who had accumulated portable wealth, cultivated a patron willing to provide ongoing support or position themselves to transition into proprietorship, arrived at this stage with options. The women who had not, whether through misfortune or through the keeper's systematic extraction of everything they generated, arrived at it with nothing except the accumulated knowledge of how the system worked, which was real but not convertible to coin. The later years of a woman's life in the entertainment quarter, if she had not managed a successful exit during her peak earning period, tended toward one of several trajectories. Some women moved down the tiers of the industry as their market value declined, working in less prestigious establishments for lower fees, continuing to generate income but at a level that barely covered subsistence. Some found their way into the informal service economy of the quarter, working as servants, cooks, or attendants in establishments where they had previously been the main attraction. Some found shelter through the Buddhist temple networks that existed in most major cities, institutions that provided a form of minimal social support to women without other means, and some simply disappeared from the record entirely, which is itself a kind of answer about where they ended up. The Buddhist refuge deserves a particular word, because it recurs in the historical record with enough consistency to be recognized as a genuine pattern rather than an occasional exception. Tang and Song period Buddhist temples, particularly those associated with the Bodhisattva Guanyin, the figure of compassion most closely associated with the protection of women, maintained a quiet relationship with the entertainment quarters of nearby cities. Women who had nowhere else to go, who had exhausted the options the secular world offered, found in temple communities a minimal but real form of institutional support. They took minor vows, performed simple labour, and were permitted to remain. It was not the retirement the romantic narrative imagined for these women, but it was, for those who reached it, a kind of stillness after a very long noise. We are near the end of our journey through this hidden world, and it is worth pausing in this final stretch to reflect on what the silence itself is telling us. History, even the hidden and unofficial kind, is always a selection, and the selection that produced the visible record of women in the Chinese pleasure quarters was made almost entirely by men. The poems that survive were mostly written by men, or written by women as recorded and preserved by men. The legal documents were generated and kept by the administrative apparatus of the male bureaucracy. The moral commentaries were authored by Confucian scholars, for whom these women were primarily a category to be regulated. And yet, within all of this male-produced record, there are moments where something else breaks through. A voice, a perspective, a financial decision that seems too specific and too practical to have been invented by someone who was not there. The Tang poet Xue Tao wrote about her own situation with a clarity that her male contemporaries rarely matched. Later anthologists working in the Song and Ming dynasties preserved her work alongside commentary that sometimes tried to explain her away and sometimes simply let her speak. Let us start with how memory was made, and then turn to what survived the making. The anthology tradition in Chinese literary culture was the primary mechanism through which a poet's work moved from the manuscript networks of its own time into the more durable form of the printed or carefully copied collection. Anthologists made choices. They selected poems that exemplified certain qualities, that fit the aesthetic categories the anthologist valued, that were associated with figures whose stories the anthologist considered worth preserving. For women of the entertainment quarter, this selection process was filtered through layers of social judgment that had nothing to do with the quality of their work. A poem by a woman whose story was edifying, whose relationship with a famous male patron could be framed as an illustration of loyalty or talent recognized across social barriers, was more likely to be preserved than an equally accomplished poem by a woman whose story offered no such redemptive framing. The result is a preserved record that is both richer than we might expect, given the social position of its authors, and more carefully curated than it appears. The women whose names and work survived into the printed collections of the Song, Ming, and later dynasties were not simply the most talented poets of the entertainment quarter. They were the women whose stories fit the narrative needs of the men who controlled the anthology tradition. Xue Tao survived in part because her correspondence with the famous poet Yuan Zhen gave her a connection to a male literary figure of unimpeachable reputation. Yu Xuanji, another Tang entertainer poet whose work has survived in substantial quantity, is preserved in part because her story, which ended in execution for a violent crime, offered the anthologist a cautionary drama that made her work worth including. What this means for our reading of the surviving record is subtle but important. The women whose financial lives we have been tracing through this story are, for the most part, not the women whose names we know. The women whose names we know are the exceptional cases, the ones whose lives generated enough narrative interest for the male literary tradition to find them worth preserving. The ordinary women, the ones who managed their peak years with quiet competence, who accumulated enough portable wealth to negotiate a comfortable exit, who settled their debts and moved into the secondary households of provincial merchants without ever composing a poem that anyone thought to copy, left almost no direct trace. And yet their traces are there, in the aggregate, in the shape of legal records that assume a certain kind of financial behaviour as normal, in the administrative registers that record not just names, but assessments of earning capacity that imply a system sophisticated enough to generate consistent differentials, in the archaeological record of objects that cluster in the material context of the entertainment quarter. These traces do not tell us about individual women, but they tell us, collectively, about what a life in those quarters was like for the many women who lived it without becoming famous, without becoming cautionary tales, without becoming anything that the official record found worth noting. They were there. The ledgers recorded them. The tax receipts counted their labour. The objects they handled and wore and stored and carried have surfaced from the earth of cities that no longer exist in the forms they knew. They were there, and the silence around their names is not the same as their absence. We are near the end of our journey through this hidden world, and it is worth pausing in this final stretch to reflect on what the silence itself is telling us. The women at the centre of this story were, for most of the dynasties that produced and regulated and taxed them, functionally invisible to the official record. They appear in legal documents when they became problems, They appear in poetry when they became symbols. They appear in moral treatises when they became examples. But their own accounts of their own financial lives, their own assessments of what they had managed to build and what had been taken from them, almost never survived. This is not simply an absence. It is an active suppression, the result of a system that had very specific reasons for ensuring that the women who funded its pleasure, its culture, and a portion of its tax revenue remained without the kind of institutional memory that might have allowed them to demand recognition. And yet the evidence persists in the objects they left behind, in the contracts they signed, in the occasional legal challenge they lodged, in the poems that slipped past the censorship of posterity. They are there, if you learn to look in the places the official histories preferred to leave dark. Let us start with the silence itself, and what kind of silence it actually is. There is a distinction in historical methodology between the silence of absence and the silence of suppression, and it matters enormously for how we read the record of these women's lives. The silence of absence is what you find when looking for evidence of something that simply did not exist, or that left no material trace because the conditions of its existence were too fragile to preserve anything. The silence of suppression is different. It has a shape. It has edges. It is the kind of silence that surrounds a space too carefully, that organizes itself too consistently around a gap, for the gap to be accidental. The silence around the financial lives of women in the Chinese pleasure quarters has the second shape. It is too consistent across too many dynasties, too uniform in what it excludes and what it permits to surface, to be simply the result of poor record-keeping or the random erosion of time. The administrative apparatus of every major Chinese dynasty was capable of extraordinary documentary thoroughness when it chose to exercise it. The same Tang bureaucracy that left us detailed records of grain prices, waterway maintenance costs, and the precise dimensions of city ward blocks somehow left us almost nothing about how women in the officially registered entertainment industry managed their personal finances. This is not an accident of preservation. It is a decision about what was worth preserving. And here is where the silence becomes paradoxically informative. The decision not to record the financial agency of these women was itself an exercise of financial agency by others, specifically by the keepers, the patrons, the officials, and the scholarly class, whose interest was served by maintaining the fiction that these women were purely passive participants in an economy that happened to run through their bodies. A record of a woman successfully negotiating her debt discharge, successfully contesting a keeper's accounting before a magistrate, successfully converting accumulated patron gifts into the capital required to establish her own operation. Each of these records, if preserved and circulated, would have been a small demonstration that the system was more porous than it wished to appear. The systematic non-preservation of such records was a form of institutional maintenance, but the porousness was real, the seams were there, and the women who found them left traces that the official silence could not entirely erase. A name in an anthology, a coin hoard in an excavated house, a contract dispute in a magistrate's archive, a small formatted paper associated forever with a poet who should, by the logic of her social position, have left nothing at all. When you step back across the 1,000 years this story has moved through, from the walled wards of Tangchang'an to the floating pleasure boats of Songhangzhou, to the morally anxious entertainments of the Ming city, what emerges is not a story of total subjugation. It is a story of constrained navigation, of women who understood the architecture of the system they were inside, and who worked its seams with whatever tools the system had inadvertently left within their reach. The tools were inadequate. The constraints were real and often brutal. The outcomes for most women were shaped far more by the system's extractive logic than by anything the individual woman managed to do within it. And yet, the coins sewn into the hem, the jade hairpin worn daily and convertible to silver when the need arose, the poem composed to a departing patron that was also a quietly insistent reminder of what he owed, the contract contested before a magistrate by a woman who had no right to be there, but was there anyway, her voice in the record, her argument preserved in the clerk's summary, even when the ruling went against her. They found the seams, and in the finding they left us something that the long silence was designed to prevent, a record, however fragmentary, of women who were present, who were thinking, and who were counting. There is a dimension of this story that the literary record tends to soften, and the administrative record ignores almost entirely, and it is the most fundamental one, the physical experience of the work itself, and what it cost the women who performed it across the span of a career. The pleasure quarters of Imperial China were not gentle environments. The hours were long, concentrated in the late afternoon and evening when the banquet culture of the official class demanded entertainment and extending often well into the night. The social labour of those hours, the sustained performance of attentiveness and warmth and wit in the presence of men who had been drinking since late afternoon, was exhausting in ways that are difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore once you begin reading the literary record with attention to its silences. And beneath the social labour lay the physical reality of a life lived in close quarters with large numbers of people, in an era without the medical understanding that might have mitigated its consequences. The body was, in the most literal sense, the primary capital asset of a woman in the entertainment quarter. Its maintenance, its protection, and its inevitable decline shaped the financial arc of her entire working life. Let us start with what we do know about how the body was valued and managed within the economics of the quarter. The fee assessments that Tang and Song government officials applied when registering women with the Entertainment Bureau were not arbitrary. They were based on a set of evaluative criteria that included musical skill, conversational ability, and social refinement, but that also included physical appearance in ways the administrative language recorded with characteristic blandness. A woman assessed at the higher earning tiers was expected to present herself in a manner consistent with that assessment. Hair dressed in the elaborate styles that fashion required, face treated with the white powder and painted rouge that the culture of the quarter considered appropriate, clothing maintained at a standard that signalled the quality of the establishment she represented. All of this had costs, and all of those costs were, in most house systems, added to the woman's debt account. The cosmetic practices of the Tang and Song entertainment quarter were not superficial vanities. They were professional requirements, and the materials they demanded were expensive. The white lead powder used for facial application, which was the standard base for the made-up face that the entertainment culture expected, was known even in the Tang period to carry health risks with prolonged use. Women who applied it daily over the course of years were absorbing a substance whose toxicity was understood imperfectly, but not entirely ignored. The vermilion used for lip and cheek colour contained mercury compounds. The elaborate hair preparations that maintained the complex styles of the period involved oils and fixatives whose ingredients varied in quality and safety, depending on the supplier. These were not choices, they were occupational conditions, and their cumulative physical effects, combined with the disrupted sleep patterns of the nocturnal entertainment schedule, the nutritional irregularities of a life whose mealtimes were subordinated to banquet schedules, and the respiratory effects of the incense-heavy interiors that the quarter culture maintained, meant that the physical capital on which a woman's earning capacity depended was being depleted even as it was being deployed. The women who understood this managed it with the same practical intelligence they brought to everything else. Rest during the hours the quarter was quiet, careful attention to the quality of the cosmetic materials they used when they had any choice in the matter. the cultivation of patrons whose preferred form of entertainment was less physically demanding, whose evenings ended earlier, whose gifts included the kinds of food that supplemented the quarter's standard diet. These were not dramatic strategies. They were the small, persistent adjustments of women who understood that their primary asset had a finite working life, and that the length of that working life was, within limits, something they could influence. The physical cost of the work was also the reason that the transition out of active entertaining, whether into concubinage, proprietorship, or the temple networks we discussed earlier, carried such urgency for women who were paying attention. The window was not just financial, it was physiological, and the women who recognised that earliest were the ones most likely to have made the necessary preparations before the window closed. You have spent this entire journey looking outward from the entertainment quarter, following the financial and social connections that ran between these women and the men who visited them, the officials who administered them, the patrons who supported them, and the keepers who controlled them. But there was also a social world that existed entirely within the quarter, between the women themselves, and it shaped the financial possibilities of everyone inside it in ways that the outward-facing record tends to obscure. The relationships between women in the same establishment, between women in competing establishments, between established figures and newcomers, between the aging and the young, these were not simply personal bonds or personal rivalries. They were economic relationships, structured by the same logic of competition, cooperation, and calculated mutual interest that organised every other dimension of life in the quarter. And they were, for the women who navigated them skillfully, a resource as significant as any patron relationship or accumulated jewellery collection. But here is where the social world inside the quarter becomes genuinely layered and worth moving through carefully. The house system that organised most women's working lives created the conditions for a particular kind of social structure within a single establishment. Women living and working in the same house shared physical space, shared the keeper's attention and accounting, and competed for the same pool of patrons. This competition was real, and sometimes sharp. A patron who shifted his visits from one woman to another within the same house represented not just an emotional loss, but a direct financial consequence, a reduction in fee income and gift receipts that had immediate implications for the slower-burning project of debt repayment and personal accumulation. And yet the competition was also constrained by interdependence in ways that made pure rivalry self-defeating. Women in the same house shared information about patrons, and that information had real value. A patron who was known among the house's women to be generous with informal tips, to give gifts of particular quality on festival occasions, or alternatively to be difficult, to drink to excess, to become aggressive late in an evening, was a patron whose characteristics were shared knowledge within the social world of the establishment. This information sharing was not altruism, it was practical risk management, a collective investment in the shared knowledge base that helped each woman make better decisions about how to allocate her time and attention. The relationships between women in different establishments operated on a different scale but according to similar logic. The entertainment quarter of a major Tang or Song city was a relatively small social world, one in which reputations, both women's and patrons, circulated through informal networks of conversation and observation. A woman who had been mistreated by a particular patron had an interest in that information reaching other women in the quarter, not necessarily out of solidarity, though solidarity existed, but because a patron whose behaviour became widely known tended to lose access to the best establishments and the most sought-after women, which was a form of collective enforcement that no individual woman could have achieved alone. The mentorship relationships between older and younger women in the quarter were perhaps the most economically significant of all the inward-facing social bonds. A young woman newly arrived in the establishment of an older, more established figure had access to a form of practical financial education that no other institution offered. How to assess a patron's likely generosity from early signals in an evening. How to manage the keeper's accounting and what to contest. When to accept a transition offer and when to hold out for better terms. How to convert gifts into savings without attracting the keeper's attention. This knowledge was not written down. It passed in conversation, in observation, in the specific texture of a more experienced woman's guidance to a less experienced one. It was the oral curriculum of the quarter, transmitted across generations by women who had learned it the hard way and who had reasons, both practical and personal, to pass it on. And so we have come, at last, to the quiet end of this long journey through the hidden economy of Imperial China. We began in a walled city at night, with a woman counting coins in the dark. We followed her world through the administrative ledgers and the debt contracts, through the gift poems and the magistrate's records, through the floating pleasure boats of Hangzhou and the lamplit alleyways of Chang'an. We traced the financial strategies of women who were classified as invisible by the state that depended on them, taxed by the dynasty that refused to protect them, and remembered, when they were remembered at all, in verses written by the men who visited them and moral treatises written by the men who disapproved. And what we found in all of that was not what the silence was designed to show us. We found women who understood the architecture of the system they were inside, and who worked its seams with the tools available to them. Small tools, mostly. A jade hairpin, a contested accounting entry, a poem composed at the precise moment that served a purpose the patron may not have entirely understood. A younger woman sitting close in the late hours of a quiet evening, listening to something that would never be written down but that would not, for that reason, be lost. These were not grand gestures. History tends to preserve grand gestures, the battles and the decrees and the monuments, because grand gestures leave large footprints. What these women left were small footprints, scattered and faint, detectable only if you are willing to look in the places the official record preferred to leave unlit. But small footprints, spread across 1,000 years and hundreds of thousands of lives, are not nothing. They are, in their accumulated weight, a kind of testimony. Think about what it means to build anything at all inside a system designed to prevent you from keeping what you earn. Think about what it requires. Not heroism, exactly, but something quieter and more durable than heroism. A sustained, practical attention to the mechanics of your own situation. A refusal to mistake the system's description of you for the truth of what you are. And a willingness to pass what you have learned to the woman beside you, so that the knowledge does not die with you when the dynasty moves on. That is what they did. Across the Tang and the Song and the Ming, across the walled cities and the floating boats, and the lamplit reception rooms, across the centuries that the official record preferred to spend looking elsewhere, they did that. Quietly, persistently, without recognition, and without much choice in the matter. We are all of us, the inheritors of worlds built by people the official record did not bother to describe accurately. The money that funded the poetry we still read passed through hands the poetry does not name. The tax revenue that maintained the cities whose ruins archaeologists are still uncovering came in part from women whose names the registrars recorded, and posterity did not. The oral knowledge that moved from woman to woman in the late hours of establishments long since vanished shaped the financial lives of generations in ways that no institution catalogued and no archive preserves. They were there, and now, for a little while tonight, so were you. Let the lanterns of Chang'an fade now. Let the sound of the pipa dissolve into the particular silence that follows music when the last note has finished resonating and the room has not yet decided what comes next. Let the canals of Hangzhou grow still and dark, the pleasure boats moored and quiet, the city folding itself inward toward rest, the way cities always have, in every dynasty, in every century at this hour. You have travelled a long way tonight through a world that worked very hard to remain hidden. You can rest now. The coins are counted, the ledger is closed, and somewhere, in the deep and patient earth beneath cities that no longer exist in any form you could walk through, the objects remain. The jade hairpin, the bronze mirror, the small ceramic vessel that once held heated wine at a banquet table, where a woman was composing in her mind the next line of a poem that would outlast everyone in the room. Let that image be the last thing you carry into sleep tonight. Not the system, not the silence, just the woman, and the poem, and the quiet persistence of a mind that kept working even when the world around it had decided, for reasons of its own, that it did not need to pay attention. Sleep well. The history will be here in the morning.